All right, Jan, take it away. Tell us what
Okay.
climate roadmap.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to share this with you. This was the a project that we undertook. It was funded by NIFA, and it was led by Eugene Kelly, who is a soil scientist. It is, the idea was, and the driving force behind this project was, how can we get science out there, good science that is transparent and is sound, that we need in order to move forward with our climate issues. I'm going to try to suppress them. Is that on me? Oh, no, it's not. Okay. So our contention was that if we were armed with good science, then we could drive policy shifts. And so we brought together a number of folks in order to develop this roadmap. And I'll tell you a little bit about how that happened and what was behind it. So, of course, the backdrop for the report was the fact that we are in a massive perilous times on planet Earth, as Rippel says. So if you look at the paper, which has many different drivers of climate change, these are the parameters that they've been monitoring for something like several years, since the 1980s. This is the 2024 report. And all of the things of the 35 drivers that they've been monitoring over time, 25 are at a critical level now. They're actually at a shocking level now. And so they opened their paper by saying we're on the brink of an irreversible climate disaster. So that's the sort of the backdrop for the study. The methodology that we used, and if you're interested in the methodology, it was a horizon scan methodology, and there's a whole chapter in this report that details that. So you can find out how to do it, but it's a visioning exercise. And it is an iterative process that's designed to generate, winnow, and prioritize science needs for the future. We pulled together over 60 scientists from very diverse areas. We had social scientists, biologists, entomologists, engineers. It was a really large group, soil scientists, and ecologists, biologists in general, as well as non-biologists. We ended up with 7 cross-cutting themes. And each of these was used to sort of frame the roadmap. Underneath each of these themes, we had several exemplar insights. And those example insights were composites of the contributions of this entire group. We had to summarize it down to a few things. And they, of course, were not meant to be comprehensive. They were meant to sort of stimulate thinking and stimulate people to share ideas in the future and move this process along. Because climate change is dynamic, the report is not meant to be an end-all. It's meant to be a starting point for discussions for the future. And it's a living, evolving document, we hope. So in the next few minutes, I'm going to provide a high-level look at some of these, of one of the priorities that we came up with, one of the themes, and then I'll briefly discuss the other things. But I chose theme 1 because it's relevant to this group here. So in theme 1, we address the complexity of solving for climate resilience in agriculture. And it argues that our science needs to be fundamentally shifted from to address combinations of stresses rather than looking at single stresses at a time. Excuse me. So one of the insights, excuse me, encourages an understanding of the impacts of biotic and abiotic interactions and their dynamics and climate-driven impacts on pathogens and pest migration in agriculture and into the future. So under that, one of those insights, we already know that even without climate change, we have an issue with pathogens. The global burden of pathogens and pests is tremendous. And yield losses can range between 10 and 30%, depending on the crop species. So these losses vary with region, but sadly, as most of you know, most of the losses are associated with regions with fast-growing populations and the poorest regions of the world. We know that these are frequently associated with emerging or re-emerging diseases. And as you've seen in the previous presentation, we're looking at an unprecedented rate in the emergence of new crop diseases around the world. This is a 7-year look that was published by Beavers Group. And you can see that, that the pathogens and pests are emerging. These, in this case, it's just pathogens emerging at unbelievable rates. And there are 2 spots in there that I was involved in diagnosing the pathogens in the US. So I know that this is happening. Now, we don't know why this is happening. We believe it's partially because they're moving with new climate patterns, but also possibly because of when they move into a new area where they've never been before, the crops or the plants that are in those areas have not been bred to resist those pathogens. So an example of this, well, in fact, there's a really interesting example from China where, and it's actually a very frightening example, which, China is a producer of many important crop species. And they reported that the relative area of cropland affected by damaging pests and diseases has quadrupled in the last 50 years in China. And the potential is that will easily double by the end of the 21st century. Another interesting case study is Black Sigatoka disease. So Black Sigatoka disease was introduced into Latin America and the Caribbean in around the 1970s. And it has really established well because of the conducive climate conditions in those areas. But what's really worrisome is that the models are predicting that the risk of infection has increased by over 40% in the since 1960 because of higher temperatures and higher humidity. So the climate is shifting and making the area more conducive to the diseases. So we really need to consider the impacts of climate when working towards these management strategies. So another area we need deeper understanding is the dynamics of biotic and abiotic interactions and how they impact agriculture. We know over the past decade that many reports have come out that plants, crop species are more susceptible to disease. So climate is exacerbating the higher temperatures associated with climate, higher humidity are exacerbating the disease and pest issues and also weed issues. For example, in this case, rice is more susceptible to bacterial blight disease in higher environmental temperatures that are already being observed in Asia. And the other issue is that we may be breeding or moving our crops to areas where the yields are enhanced under higher temperatures, but unfortunately, the potential for diseases increases in those areas, and we're seeing the fact that the gains that we get by improving our crops by breeding practices are lost when we have pathogens associated with those. In this example, rice is a case of that. I use a lot of rice examples because I work with rice. And again, our breeders have worked for years to introduce sources of resistance into crops. And what we're seeing is that that resistance can be broken down at the higher temperatures. Again, these are environmental temperatures already being observed. And so, for example, you can see that the disease in this case is much higher on this particular resistance gene at high temperatures than low temperatures. So the gene essentially is ineffective at high temperatures. So not only that, but when the breeders have introduced high temperature tolerance into some of these crop species, we've observed that those plants that are more resistant to high temperatures are more susceptible to pathogens. So whatever pathways they're changing are making the plants more susceptible. So we need to pay attention to not only the disease pressures, but also the temperatures. So if you're breeding for drought tolerance or heat tolerance, you need to think about the pathogen stress before you put it out in the field. So we clearly have to embrace the complexity of these interactions. We no longer have the luxury of breeding for disease resistance, for breeding for heat tolerance, for breeding for drought tolerance. We have to pay attention to the whole story. So I focused so far on diseases mainly because I'm a plant pathologist. But clearly, this isn't just true for plant pathogens. It's also true for insects. We know that insects, there's a huge body of work showing that you can see increased overwintering survival. You can see geographic range shifts in insects. You can see increased generations, increased ability to deliver pests or pathogens. And also with weed species, we're seeing adaptation because they're kind of like a genetic box that can change and fit into any environment they want to. So the other theme that I will talk about under theme 1, another example that I'll talk about briefly is the example of where we need to be headed with our forest systems. So we're counting on our forest systems to mitigate the impacts of climate change. We're counting on them for long-term carbon storage. And the problem is that stresses like wildfires, environmental stresses exacerbated by climate change, like wildfires, pests, and diseases, are really contributing to a growing backlog of reforestation needs in the United States. And into the future, we have to start thinking about how are we going to manage this? We need technological advances to help mitigate these threats. And that's something that we need to look towards the future. So the remaining themes in the workshop cover participatory research projects or processes, which are absolutely critical because then while you're doing the research, it's in the hands of those who are going to implement it and they understand it. The theme 3 was talked about the need to optimize and manage agricultural systems with strategies that enhance soil health, carbon sequestration, biodiversity, and other ecosystem services. For example, we need to better understand how the crop microbiomes are influenced by climate change and how they can help us mitigate climate change impacts on crops. Theme 4 talks about the challenges facing management of precious water resources, something that we in the West are very aware of. Theme 5 talks about the improvement of opportunities in clean energy-based agriculture. Theme 6 talks about regenerative agricultural sciences and how we need to strengthen those practices. And theme 7, the last of the themes, focuses on socioeconomic and policy research. So this policy clearly is needed that is based on scientific evidence, and this is of course essential for driving our research forward. But what was emphasized as we were talking about this during the meetings was that we need research into policy and socioeconomic practices. So this is what the climate change roadmap is in a nutshell. And it brought a lot of ideas forward for us for the future and how we can move forward. But it did not talk about implementation, and that was not what it was directed towards. And that's now what NIFA is looking towards, is how do we implement these plans? How do we move these things forward? How do we translate some of the ideas? And that's essentially what you're here for in a nutshell. So you noticed that it was a big group of people that was involved, and I need to thank the team. The team at Colorado State, we managed it, but we had help from the Meridian Institute, and they were wonderful. And also in the roadmap, there's a list of all the people that were involved in it, but each of those people reached out to a number of other people. So the roadmap, that's part of the Horizon process, integrated a lot of ideas that were very, very diverse. And finally, I was given this slide. I'm supposed to tell you that I am a part of the 6th National Climate Assessment. I think this is the first time that they've had a pathologist involved in this, they told me. And so I think if you have any ideas that you think this process is just starting, in fact, there's a call today that I'll miss, but it'll be a year-long process of gathering ideas. And I hope we can get some plant pest stuff into this. And that's all I have to say.
Thanks, Jan. Questions, comments for Jan? Or on any other earlier presentations in the session? Jim?
Yeah, so where has this gone?
So NIFA has used it, the Secretary of Ag has been talking about it. We've talked about it at the National Academies in 2 different presentations. We're working on an article for like a perspective for science or something like that. We're trying to get it out to the scientific community, and what we have not done is any outreach to the public. It's mainly been to policymakers and scientists and academics. Yeah.
So Jan, the target, this was funded through NIFA, but the target is USDA as a whole for how they view the climate roadmap.
It was really to assess what research is needed, and that could be picked up by anyone. And in fact, the hope was that all the funding agencies would look at it, like NSF, USAID, all the funding agencies would take a peek at it, because it crosses all disciplines.
And this was a congressionally directed project, if I remember right. Congress said they wanted this done.
That was a separate one that Banner did.
Oh, okay.
Mhm. Board on Ag and Natural Resources.
So Marty, if I jump in here, this was actually the way it was put together, as yes, NIFA did guide it and help make it happen. But the idea was to have a sort of a roadmap for the scientific community as a whole. So it's not just NIFA's, it's open to the community, of course, including the federal agencies, but the community as a whole.
It was just a channel of how to move the funds to do it.
Right.
Okay.
And NIFA worked, so it came through our climate priority team with Kevin Kephart, myself, and Megan Oak, and a few others at NIFA. And the idea was to bring everybody together to build something that would give the wider picture and could be used for information as well as a reference as you are going forward working with the climate situation. So that was the original idea where it stemmed from. At that point, Kerry Castile there's a long history behind it, and I won't spend too much time going into it, but it was initially it started off that we'd have a climate summit and bring everyone together as a summit, but then it morphed into a roadmap as that was considered. It was, determined that would be a better vehicle and would bring along more people and more perspectives into it.
Thanks, Rebecca. Jillian, you had a comment?
Yeah, this is Jillian Lang. In my new role, one of the things I've been tasked with is sitting on what's called the Agricultural Threats Working Group. And so this is really meant to be sort of within our Bureau for Resilience, Environment and Food Security, the group that's kind of monitoring, and then if there's an issue that needs support or further research, we are advocating upwards. And that's also across both interagency. In fact, I'm meeting with FAO on Wednesday. My question that just came to mind, Jim, is in your early slides, is if it feels like there's congruency in a definition of an emerging threat. And across, and then when I say like congruency, I mean across academics, across the federal agencies, and maybe that's a naive question, but I also can see that being problematic if we don't have an agreement on the definition of such. You had that map and that
Yeah.
just kind of triggered for me.
That's a good question. I've found that different sciences use the term differently even. And emerging could be that it was introduced by someone, or it was introduced naturally, but I don't know, Jim.
Yeah, maybe that's a Jim question.
You get into semantics and even what makes it a threat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do we recognize that this thing is a threat? And sometimes it's too late when we recognize, and sometimes we really guessed wrong.
Well, there are multiple definitions.
I figured.
But it's usually used in reference to something that is new in an area, new in respect to, say, a crop, and is increasing in either prevalence or severity. So those are the most common uses of the term. I just gave a talk on this not long ago, and the discussion was not satisfactory afterwards. But yeah, it's usually in reference to something that is a new occurrence and increasing in either prevalence or severity.
Maybe I can move forward.
For sure. Other questions or comments? Jim?
Well, I just want to follow up with rubella. Rubella, is NIFA or USDA going to push this out to agencies and other federal departments to try to kind of get to the point that was just made about getting some consensus across the federal system?
So the thing is, it has been shared, and it is being shared through all sorts of ways that we can. Kevin put it out, and also with the interagency groups that are there. So in that sense, yes. And we are also, referring to it as we are going along with our discussions on the science, on the climate situation. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, more or less, it just seems
More or less.
one trait that, going back to Steve's comment earlier, that we lack with these initiatives is persistence. It isn't just a single outreach, it has to be continuous.
Yes, so the thing is, from NIFA's perspective, and it is as part of several other agencies as well, but being involved in it here, NIFA we all have climate accomplishment plans and strategic goals that we are having to report out on, and NIFA particularly is very much on top of it, if you put it that way. And these things have been reported out. They are being wrapped up at the USDA level now with the change in administration. We don't know where things are going to go, but all our staff within NIFA, of course, including Kevin Kephart, who is the Deputy Director for the Institute for Bioenergy and Climate, they have been doing a lot of outreach, as has Jan and Jean been, talking about this, and the roadmap has, picked up quite a bit of interest, and be as is being referred to as so. That's the sense at which it is right now, but this is something that we are continuously using, and this is not the only thing. This is a part of the other accomplishments. In fact, we just put together a big report on all the accomplishments in the climate change area. So there is this the way we are looking at climate change in NIFA. I mean, and being very honest, NIFA is part of all of the climate change efforts and is leading a lot of the things, but NIFA did not get any extra funding per se for climate change. So the approach we have been taking is we have put in, we have developed rapid response program. There's several other programs, environmental justice and other things that have been put together that are dealing with this, but we are also integrating climate change into RFAs across several programs throughout, and we are encouraging people to address those as they are looking at different aspects, including, of course, the plant protection aspects of plant protection programs. So that is where things stand realistically at this time.
Yeah, I would just, well, I guess my point is, if each federal department and the agencies within all have their own sets of goals and perspectives, that's a pretty hard thing to bring to Congress to get them to wrap their minds around.
I probably could now provide answer on the other end of this. So Kevin Morgan, Homeland Security. So we're the lead on coordinating the annual risk assessment, national risk assessment focused on food and ag sector, in coordination with our the lead federal agencies, USDA and FDA. So part of the challenge we've had is under this new national security memorandum, 16 focused on improving the security and resilience of the food and ag sector. Our first risk assessment, which is one of the requirements under NSM 16, is that we tend to fall back on what we've done traditionally, and that was focused on deliberate threats, terrorist threats against the food and ag sector. And if you look at most of the intelligence products out there, there is no threat, which we know is not true, but that's just kind of the mindset that we take. But now this, with the second attempt this year, the whole point of NSM 16 is to push us to look beyond those deliberate threats, to look at these naturally occurring kinds of threats like invasive species, AMR, and some of the climate impacts that we're seeing. And so we're aware USDA is involved with writing this national risk assessment. So we were aware of the roadmap, and that was incorporated, aspects of that were incorporated. But of course, in risk assessment, particularly something at the national level, this is an iterative process. So we have a long way to go to get this to where it's more meaningful. Last year was a classified report focused on those terrorist threats, so of limited use to anybody. This year we're deliberately pushing it down to the below the classified level and starting to address these natural occurring things to start to try to get at more effectively. And I can say we are really trying to pound on the need for the focus on plants as a separate aspect of environment. We agree wholeheartedly that we lose a lot of granularity when we simply wrap plant threats into the overall environment. So we're getting there. A long way to go.
I would say that one thing that we have been doing is we've been going to different society meetings. So Karen and I organized a session at APS, and I know other societies have picked it up, because the implementation now is what needs more experts in a given area. Because we had a very broad group of experts for this, and now we need really the down to the ground experts. And to come up with how are you going to implement these things, or what needs to be implemented and how do you. But I don't know. Is Karen down there?
Karen had to step up for.
Oh, okay. Because I had COVID, so I had to do my presentation online during, and then we had a forest fire. So I couldn't make it to the APS meeting, so I don't know what, how many people participated in.
It was a big session at APS. Yeah, it was in the main room and there were 300 people probably. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was very well attended, and we did have some. In addition to the presentations, we had roundtable discussions on several topics. We have the notes together. I believe that's on our to-do list, Jan, to put them together with Karen and come up with some sort of a report or however we want to do it. But that could also be used as some sort of stakeholder input on these, because they were all pathologists out there.
Mike Hawkins speaking, is your work getting out to the land grant system such that they're thinking about new faculty hires that ought to be more, entertain multiple disciplines instead of just we're locked into our little silos?
Well, there are several initiatives out there that look at that, like the Phytobiomes Initiative. Which is actually an international society now. That looking at the system, looking at it holistically rather than looking at it one stress at a time. Sorry. And then also, we presented at APLU, and it was a well-attended session at APLU, and had a lot of good questions from deans and presidents and those people that attend APLU normally. And that was good because they were really interested. They asked a lot of questions about how do we get people to work together on this, and how do we break down the silos between the disciplines in order to think system-wide, which is really what we're asking.
I have a colleague who's in, he just was plant biology, but he just has the plant biome is just changing dramatically.
Mhm.
And they're filling a new position to try to address that, but also incorporate climate change into their teaching.
Yeah.
What about the State Department of Ags? Like, are they being pulled into this conversation? I feel like they're a big group that I haven't heard mentioned. But I guess that isn't necessarily
Yeah,
just
yeah.
for you, but to anyone here.
So there have been, I guess, what I would say are kind of peripheral discussions with the National Plant Board and with the regional plant boards, but not these documents specifically that I'm aware of. But the National Plant Board is who we would try and interact with, because that really basically brings all of the state plant regulatory officials together in one room.
It seems like they should have it.
Mhm.
And I would say they have a big role in the monitoring for these organisms as well through the CAPS program.